Good morning, metalheads of the internet, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Metal Meltdown. Today, by very popular demand, we will be reviewing every single studio album from legendary American death metal crew, Morbid Angel. As per the norm with these reviewing every album style videos, I am not interested in EPs, demos, live albums, or compilations, or anything released by any kind of solo project or side project. I am looking specifically at Morbid Angel and all of their studio albums. I will be talking about them in order of release and assigning each a score out of 5. 0 obviously being the worst, 5 obviously being the best. With that out of the way, let's get started with Altars of Madness, the band's official debut album, released May 12, 1989 via Earache Records. Quite possibly one of the most iconic and influential death metal or extreme metal records ever, and for very, 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 very good reason. I mean, this thing is hella heavy, hella complex, hella nasty, hella dark, hella fucked up. It's got a very crisp, punchy, clean, transparent production that doesn't compromise the rougher edges, the gnarlier bits and pieces. And it's just overall an extremely intense and entertaining record from start to finish. Put simply, it's easy to see why this album was such a big deal back in 1989, and also very easy to see why it remains a big deal over like 35 years later. Well, 34 years, actually, to be super specific, but whatever. The point is, it went fucking hard back in the day, and it goes fucking hard now. Songs like Chapel of Ghouls, Maze of Torment, Immortal Rites, Lord of All Fevers and Plagues, Evil Blasphemy, they remain just as demented, just as sick and twisted now as they were back in the day. There's an energy to these songs and to this entire album that is kind of unmatched. Like, this thing is just distinctively evil and brutal with a lot of crazed performances, sick, ghastly vocals, over-the-top, manic, almost occasionally nonsensical guitar work. Like, Trey Azagoff has gone on record with saying that he didn't really care much for scales back in the day. He was actually pretty influenced by psychedelic music, especially Pink Floyd, and he really just wanted to play a bunch of crazed, fucked up nonsense. He also very strongly believed that Morbid Angel were competing with a lot of other young death metal bands at the time, and therefore just had to up the ante. They had to get more brutal. They had to get faster. They had to get more technical. They had to get weirder. They had to get crazier. Sonically, this is probably one of the most unique records to come out of the death metal scene in the late 1980s. I mean, there are other records that sound similar in a lot of ways, but nothing that sounds quite like this. I'm feeling a solid 4.5 out of 5 on this one. Probably one of the best debut albums ever. Probably one of the best classic American death metal records ever. It just kicks fucking ass and doesn't take any goddamn fucking names. Period. What more do you need to know? If you ever wanted to know what a tornado from hell might sound like, destroying everything in its path, this is it. Check it out if you haven't already. Next up, we have Blessed Are the Sick, released May 2nd, 1991 via Earache and Relativity Records. A lot of big changes already happening to the Morbid Angel sound. Good changes, though, I feel, for the most part. There are a lot of easily identifiable classical undertones across the album, a lot of instrumental pieces, some more complex and distinguished arrangements. In fact, Trey would go on to dedicate the album to Mozart. Overall, this is a slower record and probably a less extreme record than Altars of Madness as well. Production-wise, this opts for a slightly less clean and punchy kind of sound. It's a little murkier. There's a little bit more reverb and feedback. David Vincent is starting to develop his vocals a little bit more. There's a little bit more exaggeration on some of those gutturals, and it definitely feels like he's trying to make this. There's a little bit more development in the vocal department as well. You definitely get the vibe that David Vincent has been paying attention to what other death metal bands are doing as he exaggerates some of those gutturals and just makes everything sound a little bit extra anguished and demented. While I do ultimately prefer the approach of Altars of Madness, I do appreciate a lot of what this album does, and I think it does pretty consistently offer some more gnarly jams. Like, I really like a lot of the classical influences. I like how the record opens. I like stuff like Rebel Lands and Thy Kingdom Come. Unholy Blasphemies, the double whammy of Blessed Are the Sick and Leading the Rats. Love seeing those signature Morbid Angel grooves really start to pop up and shine. They're slimy, they're gross, they're gnarly. They make me want to bang my head into a fucking concrete wall. I'm feeling a very strong 4 to 5, leaning towards a 4.5 to 5. Again, I just prefer Altars straight up, but this is a great record in its own right and another classic death metal record that you should absolutely check out if you have not already. Next up, we have Covenant, released June 22nd, 1993 via Earache Records and Giant. And we have arrived, ladies and gentlemen, at one of the biggest death metal records of all time. Just like Altars of Madness, wickedly influential, wickedly iconic. It just so happens to also be literally one of the best-selling death metal albums ever. Put very simply, this album's a big fucking hit, and it's, much like Altars of Madness, very easy to see why. This thing's killer, man. Musically, this combines the best elements of Altars of Madness with the best elements of Blessed Are the Sick. It's brutal and evil and has some really punishing grooves and vocals, but it's also distinguished and extremely well written and produced. Pain Divine is a full-on rager. Stuff like Blood on My Hands and The Lion's Den are extremely menacing with some really sick, slow-moving grooves and passages. Stuff like World of Shit and God of Emptiness even come damn near close to Death Doom, considering just how big and heavy and, like, powerful some of those grooves and riffs are. There's also Sworn to the Black, which throws in some legitimately kind of weird, jagged rhythms and shit. I don't know, it almost feels more like Voivod trying to do a death metal rager. From what I understand, this record was a big influence on Portal, and when it comes to songs like that, I can kind of see why. Lyrically, too, this is probably one of Morbid Angel's darkest records, drawing a lot of influence from the Sumerian religion, the occult, theistic Satanism, Nietzschean philosophy. I just love it, man. I love the complexities and nuances here. I love how fierce and brutal it still is. Very strong 4.5 out of 5 from me. Of all of the records we're talking about today, I probably had the most fun revisiting this one specifically. Next up, we have Domination, released May 9th, 1995 via Earache Records and Giant once again. Another solid record from Morbid Angel. Let's not waste any time here. This may not be as progressive or as ambitious as something like, say, Blessed Are the Sick or Covenant, but it makes up for that by still throwing in at least a few twists and turns and by prioritizing big, gnarly, slimy, stupid, beefy, meaty grooves. Like, there are some super addictive, tasty, satisfying grooves all over the place here. Sometimes in some more cinematic jams like Caesar's Palace and Hatework, and sometimes just kind of in a full-on fucking rager banger beatdown of epic proportions, like Dominate, or Where the Slime Live, which just so happens to be my all-time favorite Morbid Angel song, if we're being honest. It just goes stupid hard, man. Like, how can you not want to throw down when you hear those big, bold, triumphant fucking grooves, and when you hear David Vincent's, like, weirdly psychedelic vocal textures, like, just layered in slime and fuzz and gross shit. Lots of other great stuff, too, like Melting, Nothing But Fear, Inquisition Burn With Me. A very solid 4 to 5 for me on this one. Maybe it's not as polished, maybe it's not as clever, but god damn it, it's fun. It's brutal. It's slimy. It's fucked up. It's everything I want from just a groovy, bangin' death metal record. Next up, we have Formula's Fatal to the Flesh, released February 24th, 1998, once again via Earache Records, and there are a lot of big differences between this and what Morbid Angel was doing beforehand. The first and most obvious of which being the presence of Steve Tucker on lead vocals, on bass. He has a drier, more brutal tone. I would also argue, if we're being honest, more one-dimensional, but fuck it, he's a competent vocalist, and he definitely has a lot to prove on this record, and he definitely proves it. He also takes over lyrically, writing primarily about the old ones, in fact, going as far as to write some of his lyrics in the ancient Sumerian language. This record also does have some more atmospheric elements, which I think is kind of cool. Aside from that, for the most part, this is a distinctively more brutal record. Like, it definitely feels like Morbid Angel was trying to compete with a lot of brutal and technical death metal at that time. Which, fine, it does make for some pretty crazed, unhinged material. It's over the top and chaotic and definitely gnarly as shit. But it's also, I would argue, maybe just a little incohesive. Like, nothing is really stitched together super well. I have a lot of individual components and segments that are really cool, but nothing really flows that well together. Like, I don't really have, like, a good chunk of really great songs. And that's not just what I'm feeling, that's also, in some cases on this album, what is literally happening. By Morbid Angel's own admission, Invocation of the Continual One is literally old riffs and unused material from Morbid Angel's very early years, stitched and sewn together into one 9.5-minute prog death metal epic. I would also say that this record feels longer than it actually is, and that kind of hurts it. It only clocks in about 51 minutes, a pretty standard runtime for any metal album, but there are 14 songs, and as we've discussed literally just a moment ago, one of them is 9.5 minutes long. It also doesn't help that it's closing on 3 atmospheric instrumental tracks, which... Not a great move, in my opinion. I'm feeling a 3 out of 5 on this, but I want to make it clear it's a very enthusiastic 3 out of 5. Like, there's enough going on, and the performances are brutal enough, and there's enough cool riffs and beats and such that it'll keep your attention. It just might not maintain it, per se, not in the same way that previous records did. Next up, we have Gateways to Annihilation, released October 17th, 2000, once again via Earache Records. This is a bit of a step down in speed and intensity from Formula's Fatal to the Flesh, but I actually think that works to Gateway's benefit. Everything just feels a little bit more focused. It's easier to kind of absorb everything, to kind of immerse yourself in this world. Summoning Redemption has a lot of momentum and a lot of energy and brutality to it. It definitely feels like a mix between Domination and Formula's Fatal to the Flesh. I really like At One With Nothing and its very punishing, pummeling grooves, coupled with its weirder guitar tones and atmospheric solos. Stuff like Aegis Still I Am to the Victor the Spoils and Opening the Gates brings that classic old-school death metal brutality as well, but filtered through everything that Morbid Angel has done pretty well up to this point. Overall, a big improvement on Formula's Fatal to the Flesh. It definitely feels like Morbid Angel was paying attention to whatever criticisms were leveled upon that record at the time, and they've actively tried to make this a more accessible and entertaining record. It keeps the crazier, more brutal aspects of that record, but combines it with more of the stuff that we know from Morbid Angel and that we expect from Morbid Angel. It makes for a really solid listen, if not remarkable. I'm feeling a 3.5 out of 5, a pretty solid one at that. You know, nothing on here really blowing my mind or anything like that, but it's a good, fun, gnarly fucking listen if you got time to kill. Next up, we have Heretic, released September 23rd, 2003, once again via Earache Records, and it's okay. Yeah, probably the weakest from this era of Morbid Angel, if we're being honest. Not bad, per se, just weak. Meh. Okay. Put very simply, there's nothing happening on this album that you haven't heard Morbid Angel do much better on another studio album. For instance, the album is a little muddier, a little messier, production-wise, I think trying to recapture the vibe of Blessed Are the Sick, but it's just not as good. The music is also more brutal and more unhinged in the vein of Formula's Fatal to the Flesh, and it's also just not as good. The riffs don't hit as hard, Steve Tucker's vocals feel especially dry here. Lyrically, he's not really doing anything that he hasn't done before. Again, on the last 2 studio albums, he's very one-dimensional in that regard, very repetitive. I feel like on some level Morbid Angel is even aware of this because nearly half the album is made up of like instrumental work. In fact, much like the aforementioned Formula's Fatal to the Flesh, it closes on multiple instrumental pieces. Still a few songs that I legitimately enjoy. I actually think it opens on a strong note as well with Enshrined by Grace and Cleansed in Pestilence, but yeah, overall, I'm not really feeling this one. 2.5 out of 5. It's okay. It's fine. It's an album. It exists. Definitely not their best album, but definitely definitely not their worst. That title belongs to Illa Divinum Insanus, released June 7th, 2011, via Season of Mist. Yikes. One of the most controversial and poorly received metal records ever. I have yet to meet anyone in real life who would defend this, who claims that they enjoy this. And I've only met a handful of people online that would defend this, that claim to enjoy this. Like, metalheads pretty much universally agree this is Morbid Angel's worst album, and possibly one of the worst metal albums ever made. I sure as hell would agree with that statement. I included this album in my top 10 most hated albums of all time video, which by now is a couple years old, but people still tune in. People still love hearing me rant about this particular album in that video, and as such there has been a lot of demand for me to return to this album, to talk about it again in some capacity. Well, congratulations, your wildest, most insane, fantastical dreams have come true. Meanwhile, I'm reliving one of my worst fucking nightmares, because I fucking hate this record. The killer is, this could have worked. Honestly. I mean, it was in development for years. It brought David Vincent back to the fold. And I don't even hate the idea of industrial and death metal being brought together. I really don't hate that. I don't. There are plenty of bands who have made that fusion work. Anal Nathrak, for instance. Arguably agoraphobic Nosebleed? I mean, they're leaning more towards, like, grindcore than they are death metal. But you get the idea. The Berserker. There's a great example. I like the Berserker. But this? Fucking this? Fucking this? Jesus Christ! I don't even know really where to begin, man. It's just such a fucking dumpster fire. It's such a fucking colossal train wreck. None of the industrial stuff is meshed well. Period. There's a lot of obnoxious electronic percussion and synthesizers and sound effects that are constantly in the way of fucking everything. The death metal itself has been stripped of all the nuance and complexity and depth that we have come to expect from Morbid Angel at this point. It's very, very basic death metal riffery and grooves and beats all around. Not incompetent, just basic. Boring. David Vincent sounds okay vocally, even though he really just spends a lot of time kind of shouting in my ear. Lyrically, this is hands down the worst thing he's ever fucking done. I mean, you've got stuff like Too Extreme and I Am Morbid, which genuinely sounds like a bunch of fucking, like, preteens writing death metal for the first time ever. There's also just tons of, like, really weird, goofy, overly eccentric nonsense, like Radicult, for instance, which is the most overproduced yet half-baked attempt at emulating a Diablo Swing orchestra number I've ever fucking seen. As well as Destructos versus the Earth Attack, which, honest to God, sounds like something that the South Park guys would have whipped up for a fucking episode about anime or the Power Rangers or some shit like that. It's just so fucking bad, man. I don't know what the fuck Morbid Angel were thinking when they put this motherfucker together. But, yeah, it's, wow. I know a lot of you were probably expecting that I was just gonna lose my fucking mind over this album, that I was just gonna scream and yell and rant and rave like the good old days of the Metal Meltdown when I was a stupid little fat shit. But, I just don't have the energy or strength in me to do that anymore. I mean, maybe if I didn't have to go to work in an hour, I would rip open a bottle of vodka and we would just go to town on this thing. But also, what are y'all going to gain from hearing basically the same rant again, just 3 years later and delivered by a thinner, sexier Robert? What do you gain from that, aside from a hard-on? I don't gain anything, so fuck it. I'm not letting this album ruin my fucking mood. I'm not letting this album ruin my fucking day. I'm not letting this fucking piece of crap boil my blood. It ain't fucking worth it. Instead, I'm just gonna reiterate that this album's fucking terrible. It was a fucking nightmare to re-listen to this. 0 out of 5. And it's insulting and terrible and sinful, and I hate it. And I'm not spending another fucking moment on this thing. 'Cause fuck it. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. It's just fucking not. Morbid Angel knows they fucked up. They have moved on. It's time for us to move on, okay? Moving on. And finally, this brings us to Kingdoms Disdained, released December 1st, 2017, once again via Season of Mist. And it's fine. Yeah. I remember when this album came out, a lot of people were just sucking this thing's dick to hell and back because it wasn't Illa Divinum Insanus and therefore was a colossal improvement and an incredible record. Which is just silly? That's a silly argument? That's a silly thing to do? I mean, obviously it's better than Illa Divinum Insanus. I could shit directly into a microphone and that would sound better. Duh. Obviously. But, like, as a standalone record, I just think this is a severely underwhelming and unremarkable listen. It feels like a repeat of 2003's Heretic, which, again, I guess that is better than being a repeat of Illa Divinum Insanus, but still not great. Steve Tucker is back, and he does have some appropriately monstrous vocals. Trey definitely sounds more at home with some more typical groove-laden death metal riffery, but we're still lacking some of the complexity and nuance of older records. The songs in general are just kind of repetitive, and they just kind of drag, and I don't know, it's just not really doing anything for me. I'm feeling a 2 out of 5 on this one. It's just kind of mediocre, like whatever. At least with Heretic, I could pick out a couple songs that I actually did enjoy. This, I really didn't enjoy a thing. Of all of the albums we're talking about in this video that I listened to in preparation for this video, this is the one I was probably the most outright bored by. I don't know, I mean, if you are one of those people who's just like, it's not Illid, therefore it's good, more power to you, I guess, but, like, would you really hold this up there with Altars of Madness, Blessed Are the Sick, Covenant, even Fatal's Formula to the Flesh, and Gateways? Because I fucking wouldn't, not for a second. It may not be steaming hot diarrhea with shards of glass, but it's still kind of shit, in my opinion, at least. Yeah. Whatevs. And voila! Reviewing every Morbid Angel album. We did it! Got a little painful near the end, but we did it. Now it's your turn. Your turn to tell me what's their best album, what's their worst album, what are their best songs, what are their worst songs, and what do you want to hear from me next? Press this button to subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately. Look, other cool videos here. And as always, you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.